surely you can't read a book wrong. That's gotta be impossible, right? You just pick the thing up, open the book, start reading the words in the order you're supposed to read them and turning the pages, and you repeat that process until you run out of book. There's no way you can get that wrong, right? Well, as it turns out, yes you can. This is not to say that simply opening the book and reading the words in the order until you run out of book is wrong. That is exactly how you read a book, but there are lots of different methods by which you can approach this. And unfortunately, the ability to comprehensively read a book, to actually go through it and understand it and extract all of the meaning from it, is a skill. And worryingly, it seems to be a skill that fewer and fewer people possess these days, because it is something that needs to be taught. And I will explain how and why I think this is a skill that is lacking in a worrying number of people as we go on. But in order to understand what's gone wrong, we have to understand how to do things right to start with. So when it comes to reading, there's a variety of ways that you can break it down. Usually you'll find this done on a level system. Sometimes it'll be 3, maybe 4, some of them even go up to 5 levels. And in some cases, some of these levels may include a so-called level 0, which is basically the primary reading ability, which is possessing the basic skill of literacy, which might seem like an odd thing to put on the scale of reading a book, but unfortunately there are still people in the world who are illiterate. So you have to start at that basic functional level 0, as it were. Another pre-level, which sometimes also gets put into the post-level stuff, you'll see why when we get there. Well, that entails looking at the landscape around the book that you have chosen to read, or in some cases helps inform the choice of book that you've got. And this entails looking at the book, looking at the genre, looking at everything else that is within that genre, looking up the author and seeing what else the author has written about. It can even now, in the day of modern technology, include looking up things like book reviews. It's really just that sort of cursory looking around and general knowledge of the world that a lot of people get without really thinking about it. But when you come up with some sort of system to quantify things, such as these systems of reading, you have to include all of these things in some sort of formal capacity. So you've made your book selection, you now have your book in your hand, you are ready to go. How do we make sure that you get the most out of this book that you've chosen for yourself? And this is where we approach our levels of reading, or in some cases, stages of reading, if you're going to be going through all of them. So the first one is simply skimming, sometimes called pre-reading, or if you'd like to be a little more pretentious about it, inspectional reading. It's all the same thing. If you're going through a textbook, this may entail simply flicking through the pages, not reading everything through in any particular order, but you're observing the chapters. You might read chapters out of order because textbooks are very frequently not meant to be read cover to cover in order. They are frequently there more for consultation than direct reading all the way through. If you're reading something which isn't a textbook, which is basically every other book, then that is going to entail going through cover to cover, but you're skimming it. You're reading it through fairly quickly. You're not looking at super in-depth forms of reading. You're just lightly going over it, familiarizing yourself with everything in the book. And that is ultimately what the point of the skim read or the inspectional read or the pre-read is. You're going through the book, you're reading through it, you're just kind of letting it wash over you. You're not necessarily thinking about what you're reading in any particular depth. That comes later. For now, you just want to get effectively an idea of the book in your head. So you know roughly what sort of chapters there are, roughly what each chapter contains, roughly what happens throughout the book. This stage is actually key because this allows you to reference things later when you start doing proper analytical reading. And you'll see why this skimming, which is a word which is usually used quite derisively of reading, and in some cases it's actually just used straight up as an insult for people. You'll find people frequently just asserting that people skim things. Oh, you just skimmed that book, you just skimmed that paper, you just skimmed a list, you don't really understand it. And if you did just skim something, you wouldn't. But it is frequently just used as an insult and as a means of dismissing people. Unfortunately, when it comes to dismissing the mere action of skimming, dismissing the action of basic inspectional reading, that is actually dismissing the core foundation of analytical reading, which we'll talk about now. Analytical reading is where you actually begin doing things like note-taking. This is where you begin to compare and contrast different areas of the book. So in this case, you're reading it through a second time, but you've got that brief overview of the book in your mind. So when you're making a note on chapter 1, you can say in that note, this also relates in chapter 3, or something else is mentioned about it in chapter 3. And so it means that you can avoid the mistake of reading the book through completely fresh and making notes as you go. One of those key mistakes is making a note earlier in the book where the explanation for that part may very well come up later, but you're not aware of it because you didn't pre-read the book. This is where you begin asking the major questions of the text. So if you're going through, say, a fiction book, you would start asking, what are these characters' motives? What would it be like to be in the character's shoes? What are the major personality quirks? What is the psychology of the character that we're going through here? In the case of something factual, it's an idea is presented here, it will be filled out later. What is the loading of that topic? How is it introduced? Why is it introduced in this manner? If things have been laid out in an order in the book, why are they in that order? In the case of more factual books, this is where you begin distinguishing between theory and practice within the book. You can do the same thing for textbooks, and you very frequently will need to do so. This will also give you a chance to work out any divisions or contradictions that the book may hold. In some cases, books may present contradiction because it is an essential part of understanding something, or it may present something that seems like a contradiction at an earlier stage in the book but is actually resolved later. And that again is another key reason to do your pre-read, to do your superficial read, to do your skim reading beforehand, because at that point you won't be caught off by those contradictions. You won't read something in the book and think, ah, hypocrite, or ah, contradiction, or ah, you just said this thing and earlier you said a different thing, you must be wrong, or lying, or misleading people, or something, as some people are wont to do these days. And moments like that highlights the importance of the skim, highlights the importance of the pre-read. So you can see the second read here, the analytical read. This is where you really begin to understand the points that the author is attempting to make. You note specific phrases that the author is using, or other specific names of authors that the writer might be referencing. For things which might be a little more factual, this allows you to start taking notes on what in English literature you might call PEE, which is point, evidence, explain, which is a presentation technique and also works very well as a debate technique. That is, if the author makes a point, you would expect them to follow up with the evidence that supports that point, and then the explanation for how that evidence and point have come together. And so you begin to note out where each of these things happen. Now, on the various level or grading systems of reading here, there's a little bit of grey area in this part, because we've mentioned observing certain phrases that the author uses, certain words that come up again and again, potentially other authors' names that come up again and again. This can be a point where it might behoove you to go and look those up to get further information on specific terms or specific phrases, because in some contexts they may mean radically different things to what you might think they mean, especially in fields which are quite specialist. You have to make a bit of a judgment call here as to whether that is going to be worth it or not. In some reading systems, in some reading levels, things like that would be put more into a comparative reading stage, and that is something which would come last after you've finished with that book to broaden your horizons as to the general sphere that that book is within in the world of literature. So at that point, you'll be looking at potentially other books that the author has written, or other authors who may be contemporary to that particular author that you've been reading. And some of that might be necessary to understand certain terms or certain phrases. So here you do have to exercise a little bit of judgment. Like, is it worth doing it now at this stage? Or is this something that we want to leave to the end so I can just be done with this book? Or do I want to go away and begin skimming something else, which will potentially expand my understanding of this first book? And so you have to kind of make that judgment call there. In some cases, you may do a little from column A, a little from column B. You may go and look up some terms or some phrases or some authors just to know who they are, and in some cases complete a superficial read of some of their work, so that you can then come back to the one that you're engaging with in the primary fashion. So you can do that. You can read multiple things at the same time, but it will normally be better if you work analytically on one book at one time, while perhaps only skimming a few other things, just so you have some awareness, because maybe that skim read might fill in a few of the blanks on the thing that you're reading right now, in that it will give you just enough information about a certain term or a certain phrase to understand the book that you're analytically reading right now. You probably do things like this all the time anyway. This will be where you find a term or a phrase that you're perhaps not 100% sure of in a book, and you'll go onto the internet and just Google search it and see what comes up. But the crucial point there is to not fall down a rabbit hole on the internet there, and to actually come away from it and get back to reading the thing that you want to analyze now. And then this will lead you on to the third stage. This will sometimes be called the critical stage or the evaluation stage. This will be a third reading through of the book. So you've completed your superficial read, you've skimmed the book where you have a vague understanding of what's in the book, you know what chapters contain what information, you just kind of let it wash over you. Then you did your analytical read. You went through and read a second time. You took notes on all of the key parts of the book. You took notes on any argumentation which was made. You took notes on character traits. In the case of fiction, you began identifying any overarching themes that may be through a book, again in the case of fiction. In things which were a little more factual, you would have been looking at any propositions that the author was making. You've noted any evidence that they made for those claims, and you've noted the explanations for how the evidence supports the point that was made. So you have, hopefully, now all of these things bookmarked throughout the book that you're reading. So now is the time for you to get critical about it, or the time to evaluate it. This is where you begin looking at the merits of the book, looking at the overall accuracy of the book. You might be able to identify logical flaws in the book, if there are any. Formal or informal, it doesn't matter. Some books might have them, other books might not. You can identify whether or not the book is internally consistent with itself, that is, if it presents a logic that works throughout the entirety of the book. To give a prime example of this, the old atheist joke about the Bible, all I had to do was read "In the beginning God," and I knew everything else past that point was wrong. Well, it's a joke for a reason. That premise being presented, as long as that premise is carried out throughout the entirety of the book, then the book is internally consistent. There is an internal logic throughout the book, which actually makes it okay. You are free to disagree with the logic of the book, even if it's internally consistent, but the important thing is that you are able to identify internal consistency. Your disagreement or agreement with a premise doesn't make something right or wrong. That is actually something completely different from reading the book and understanding the book. You can absolutely do it in the critical and evaluation stage, but you just need to be aware that that is something that comes last in this process. After all of this is done, you will hit the final stage, stage 4 or 5, depending on how you're counting this. And this is the one which we touched on a little bit earlier and said, well, sometimes this can be at the beginning or at the end, and this is where you will begin doing a synopsis or a synoptical reading. In other systems or levels or means of codifying this, it can sometimes be called comparative reading as well. This is where you'll really begin making links between the book that you're reading now and other books. So you'll begin connecting this author to other things that the author has written. You'll begin connecting this author to other authors. You'll connect their book to other books. You'll start seeing the same themes being addressed in other books, or the same topics being addressed in other books. Essentially, what you're doing at this stage is you're taking the information that you've gleaned from your analytical stage and your evaluative stage, and you're linking all of that information to other books that exist, usually other books that you've read in the past, other books that you have done the analysis and the evaluation of as well. Although in some cases, doing this can also lead you to the superficial stage of the next thing that you want to read. And this stage is very important because it sets up that superficial stage for the next thing, which is the key point. It is setting you up to continue reading. Ideally, you should never hit a wall where you think, that's it, that's enough, I'm done. The ideal scenario is that whatever you're reading now will inspire you to go and look for other things, because it will broaden your ability to understand the one thing that you've read here. And in doing this, you hopefully end up with this wide-spanning web of understanding of a topic, or in some cases multiple topics, and ideally you have multiple books on whatever topic it is that you're doing which have loads of things bookmarked in them so that you know what they are, where they are, what they're saying, what the main point is that it's making, and the ability to reference it to other things. So you may even, at this stage, begin doing your superficial or analytical read of another book, come back to the primary book, the one that you started with, re-enter the synopsis stage, re-enter the comparative stage, and put in a note next to some of your analytical notes, this other author, this other book, this other page even. And taking all of these things together, this is how reading actually breeds knowledge and understanding in yourself. It is a skill that I think a lot of people are lacking, but crucially, I think it is a skill that everyone is capable of learning. And unfortunately, in today's fast information world, I think that this is not only a skill that a lot of people lack, but it's a skill that a lot of people are actively pushed away from learning. I mentioned earlier the ability to look something up on the internet and tumble down a rabbit hole. This happens all the time. Even with such colloquial phrases such as doom scrolling, the idea that people just scroll through things on the internet, effectively superficially reading dozens of things, frequently in one day, perhaps even hundreds of things in one day, and they're just getting this superficial understanding of what they're reading. There's nothing that ever goes beyond that. And this is not to denigrate the internet and to say that you can't do analytical readings of it and evaluative readings of things you find online. You absolutely can, and there certainly are people who do that. But I think a lot of people don't. And this is because a lot of content on the internet is effectively fire and forget, short attention span stuff. You've seen this with the rise of things like TikTok and YouTube Shorts. It's not actually designed to give you any sort of deep understanding of anything or any particularly large amount of information. Another quick thing to be aware of, especially when it comes to internet content and analytical and evaluative media, don't fall into the trap of thinking that video essayists meet any of these criteria. Some of them might, but in my general experience, a lot of them do not. A lot of them tend to have only done superficial readings themselves of things. In some cases, they may have briefly touched into the analytical side, but a lot of the readings that they give of certain topics are very superficial, they're very surface level. And you might find that they throw out odd references and quotes to other things, but it's very rarely actually providing any particular depth to the topic that they're discussing, and is more just a veneer of credibility, because it's usually things that were found in the primary stages, in the earlier skimming stages, where they found some reviews of something, or found some quotes on some website somewhere and now think, oh, this is an authority on something, or if I just say this and quote this person, it will make what I'm saying sound as though it's very smart and authoritative, even though it isn't. And a final word on something a little more insidious, if I wanted to be as uncharitable as possible to it, and that is people who run book clubs, and you can find these in real life, you can find them online. People who go through a wealth of books in a very short time, where they'll say, this week's book is whatever. If you're just reading things which are best described as absolute trash, then you can probably get away with this. Like if you have a Twilight book club or something like that, you can get away with this because it's abundantly clear that no one actually cares and it's more about the social aspect. However, when you get people who attempt to go through some of the great works of history in a breakneck fashion, the sorts of people who will say, this week we're doing the writings of Homer, and the week after that we're going to be looking at the writings of Tacitus, and then after that we'll go through Marcus Aurelius, and then the week after that we'll look at Thomas Hobbes, and then the week after that John Milton, the week after that Martin Luther, and they just keep going. Like a week after that we'll do Hume, and then in a week we'll do Immanuel Kant. 1 week is not enough to do even a superficial reading of one of their books, let alone anything analytical or evaluative. Unfortunately, when you attempt to go through such dense works as those authors and many others besides in such a quick fashion, you can be pretty sure you're dealing with a philosopher-funculist. They are really attempting to claim philosophical expertise to have the appearance of being a philosopher or someone who is well educated on these topics when they are not. And you'll know this by the speed at which they claim to be going through these things. And a final word regarding not only speed of going through things, but also methods by which people may choose to go through books. I put audiobooks in similar categories to these things and would normally class them as a superficial read at best. The main reason being, when a lot of people have audiobooks playing, they tend to be doing other things, which means they have their attention divided. This does not loan itself to information retention or understanding. It is also difficult to make analytical notes on audiobooks. It's also difficult to go back and reference certain parts because you can't flick from one page to another, as it were. This is not to say using audiobooks for analytical or evaluative purposes is impossible. You certainly can, and they can certainly be very useful tools for scholars who are blind. But in that case, you are using them as a substitute for a book and treating them in the same way that you would a book. It's not something that you just have on in the background while you play computer games or do the dishes, what have you. You're actively sitting, listening to it, and taking notes as you go through it. It is the primary media you are engaging in, not some tertiary thing that just happens to be on in the same room as you. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, how to read books and do so more effectively, and a few pitfalls to avoid on the way just for good measure. This was a skill which used to be taught in English language and literature courses, and is unfortunately something that seems to be left by the wayside these days. As I said, there are multiple ways you can structure this with varying levels or stages of reading, but they are all broadly similar. Hopefully this was all of some interest or use to you. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.